Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the end of the conference to see this talk. My name's Liz Sander, and I'm going to be talking about evolutionary algorithms and how we can use them to perfect the art of finding good enough solutions for difficult problems. So let's say that you work for UPS or USPS. Okay. Let's say you work for USPS and you have a lot of stops you need to make and a lot of deliveries you need to make. So how do you decide what route to take or how to assign people to go along a route? This is actually a really difficult problem. If you have 60 or more stops, then there are more possible routes than there are atoms in the universe. So clearly we need some way of distinguishing between all these possible routes. Another case that is relevant to my biologist friends is if you work with zebrafish, someone needs to take care of the zebrafish. And everyone has different scheduling constraints, and so you need to figure out how do you schedule people and meet all the constraints so that zebrafish get taken care of and you have as few conflicts as possible. This is also a really challenging problem. And finally, a case that's near and dear to my heart. So in Skyrim, this is a screenshot from the game Skyrim. You have a maximum carry weight, and every item has a weight and a value, so what you can sell it for. And so if you're in a dungeon, there's way more stuff than you can pick up than you can keep with you. So you need to decide, what do you keep? So you don't want to spend all of your time working out the exact optimal solution, right? You want to get back to town so you can sell your stuff and get a sweet house in Whiterun. So we need to find some way of distinguishing between all these solutions, which we can't possibly enumerate, and find something that's good enough so that we can just pick something and move on. Right, so sometimes we can't find the best solution. There are just too many, and there's no simple way to find the absolute best. But most of the time we don't need to. Right? We just need to find something that's good enough for our purposes. So let's focus on finding an answer that's good enough. And so this is where evolutionary algorithms comes in. Well, so I kind of lied in my talk title a little bit. I am going to talk about evolutionary algorithms, but I'm going to talk more generally about heuristic optimizers with a random component. So I could have put that in my title instead, but this is a really boring name, and probably none of you would have come to my talk. So I'm just going to break down some of the jargon that's in this name. So heuristic just means a rule of thumb, right? We can't guarantee that we're going to find the absolute best answer. We're using heuristics to do it. An optimizer means that we're maximizing or minimizing some function, and depending on what field you're coming from, this may be called different things. So it may be called an objective function, a cost function, or a fitness function. I'm going to try to be consistent throughout and use fitness functions, but just so you know, these are all basically equivalent. And the random component just means that it's non-deterministic. So there are heuristic strategies like greedy solutions that don't involve any randomness at all. But what I'm going to focus on today are solutions or are algorithms where you're making some changes based on randomness, where you're initializing solutions based on randomness. So why are we using these heuristic algorithms? There are methods out there, right, that guarantee that we find the true optimal solution if you meet the assumptions. So gradient descent is a really common optimizer, but it makes a lot of assumptions, right? You have to have a convex function, it needs to be differentiable, and there are a lot of really difficult but important problems out there that we need to solve that don't meet these assumptions. So if you have just a function like this, and this is a pretty simple case, right? This is a one-dimensional problem. So x would just be some variable that you're trying to optimize over, and y is the value, the fitness value. Because this has multiple peaks and basins, this is something that gradient descent isn't guaranteed to find the optimal solution for. Things get even worse if you have a fitness landscape or a fitness function that is discrete. So if your inputs to the function are discrete, like a vector of ones and zeros, it's obviously not differentiable. But you still want to solve this problem. So what do these optimization functions look like? A lot of times they're pretty high dimensional, so they have a lot of inputs and one output. So in this Skyrim looting example, which if you're familiar It's basically the knapsack problem. It's like just a fun version of the knapsack problem. So that has a lot of inputs. You have all of the possible items you could put in your inventory, and one output, which is the value of everything that you're carrying. So when it's high dimensional, it means there's a lot of possible solutions, and so we need some way to search through all of those. Another common feature, or a feature that we'd like for these objective functions, is that nearby solutions are of similar quality. So if you look at this function here, there are some big jumps where if you change x a little bit, you get a big change in the fitness. But for the most part, if you make a small change, it's going to make a fairly small difference in the fitness function. And this is really important because we need to traverse this space somehow. If it's just a completely random landscape, there's really no point in doing any searching. We may as well just either generate a bunch of random solutions or just take one and go with it. And so just to ground this optimization function in like the examples that I gave, this USPS case, which is basically the traveling salesman problem, what you're trying to do is minimize distance. For the scheduling problem, which is basically related to the nurse scheduling problem, you're trying to minimize conflicts. And for the Skyrim looting problem, you're trying to maximize the value. So here's an example of what a realistic fitness function might look like. This is only 2 dimensions, but you can see like all these solutions are discrete. You have multiple local optima. So this is like a peak. It looks pretty promising, but the true optimum is actually over here. So it's pretty complex, and it's hard to traverse it's hard to know exactly how to traverse it, and you're probably not going to know exactly what your fitness function looks like. So ideally, we would like to find this global maximum, but if we find something that's not exactly the best solution, we might be able to get by with this. So here's an example of a fitness function. I'm going to be using the knapsack problem, the Skyrim looting problem, throughout for my code examples. So at the top, I just have some example inputs. So the solution is going to be a vector of 1s and 0s, which is basically we have 5 items, and then a 1 means we're putting it in the inventory, and a 0 means we're excluding it. Each of those things has a weight, which are fixed for those items. It has a specific value, so like a cell value, that's also fixed. And then we have a maximum weight that we can carry. And then for the fitness function, it takes in all of those things. So the knapsack is the solution here. I'm just doing this in a very simple, basic way, where you start with 0, and then you iterate over all of the items in the solution. If it's present in your candidate solution, then you add the weight and the value of that item. And then we want to check, do we meet the constraints, right? If the total weight is higher than the maximum weight that we can carry, this has value 0 to us, right? You can do other things like apply a penalty for going overweight, but this is just like the simplest case of a fitness function. And so if we do meet that constraint, then we want to return the total value. So first I'm going to start off with a very simple version of one of these heuristic optimizers with a random component, and that's a hill climber. So let's say we have a really simple fitness function that's pretty easy to traverse. This is continuous, there's only one peak, so that's cool. First we want to randomly initialize a solution, and so I've just started right there. Then I'm going to apply a mutation, and that means I'm just going to make a small change to that solution and move nearby. So here I'm making a small change, and so this is my candidate solution right here. This is where I started. If that candidate solution is better, then we accept it. If it's worse, then we always reject it. And so basically this is just a local optimization. It's climbing this hill. And so if you have a solution that's better, then you accept it, and you keep moving like this until you reach the top of whatever peak you started near, basically. So what are the properties of this? It gets stuck in local optima a lot, obviously. It's a local optimizer, but it's really fast. It's so simple. You're basically just generating solutions, you just accept whatever's better. And so it requires basically no tuning. There are really no parameters to change there except how you're mutating the solution. And that means it can actually be a really good solution to some problems. It's so fast that you can just start it a bunch of times, and hopefully you'll start near the true global optimum at one point, and you'll climb that hill. Oh, that's the wrong title. But yeah, if you have a more complicated function like this, then it's not going to do quite as well. But maybe if you start it a bunch of times, you'll be able to find that peak. So I'm just going to give you a code example for the hill climber because it's the simplest of the ones that I'm going to look at. I'm not actually going to go through a full code example for each of these, but I do have like a GitHub repository that has code examples for everything that I'm talking about. So to initialize the Skyrim looting problem, I'm just taking in the number of items in the knapsack. And then I'm just basically I'm just pre-allocating a list of zeros, and then I'm iterating one by one and basically just flipping a coin as to whether I add it or not. So this is kind of a dumb way to initialize the knapsack, but it can work. And as a simple mutation function, all I'm doing is just flipping one bit. So basically that means I'm going to randomly select an item, and if it is in the inventory, I'm going to remove it. If it's not in the inventory, then I'm going to add it. So here I'm just doing that by choosing an index in the list and then swapping it. And finally, the hill climber itself. So you can see this is not that much code. This is in pretty big font on this slide, and it all fits. These algorithms actually don't really take that many lines of code to write. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking in a number of steps. So that's how many times I'm trying to generate a new solution. The weights and values, those are the fixed parameters of the problem that I mentioned before. The maximum weight that you can carry, and a random seed for reproducibility. So first I'm going to initialize my solution. Then I'm going to calculate the fitness of it. And then for each step, I'm going to make a small change, and that's my candidate solution. And then I'm just going to compare the fitnesses of those two. And then I repeat that for however many steps I'm running it and return the best. So the next one I want to talk about is simulated annealing. This is actually pretty similar to hill climbing, but it has a changing temperature. So what does that mean? The temperature is essentially a probability of accepting a bad step. And this is kind of based on the idea that molecules at a hotter temperature tend to move around more randomly, whereas at a colder temperature, they're less likely to move around and they'll only move into a more stable configuration. So at a hot temperature, we'll accept a lot of bad steps, and it's essentially a random walk. We'll make some change and we'll just say, yeah, sure, let's try that. At a colder temperature, it's more like a hill climber. You're not accepting as many bad steps. So you have this kind of continuum. At very hot temperatures, it's a random walk. At very cold temperatures, it's a hill climber. And the idea is that you start at a fairly hot temperature to explore the fitness landscape, and over time, you're cooling the temperature, and so you're honing in more and more on promising areas of the fitness landscape. And so at the beginning, if this is your fitness function, you could have, so it's just like a hill climber where you only have one solution at a time, but in the early steps, you're going to be all over the place. You're just trying to explore this whole landscape and find promising areas. As the temperature cools down and you run it for longer, you're going to be honing in on these peaks. And hopefully, by the time you've cooled it and you're finished running the algorithm, you're fairly close to the optimum solution, although it's possible that you'll still get stuck in a local optimum. So this is great because it gives us both exploration and exploitation. So exploration is traversing the fitness landscape, trying to find promising areas, and exploitation is working in a region where you already have been and trying to find the absolute best solution in that region. This is still really fast because you only have one solution at a time, and really the only overhead you're adding is keeping track of the temperature. But there is more tuning. So there are cooling schedules. You have to figure out how hot of a temperature are you starting at, how cold do you end it, how do you change that temperature over time. You can potentially reheat it. There are lots of variants, and there's a whole little cottage industry of people writing papers about simulated annealing and the best cooling schedules under different conditions and for specific problems. Probably your problem doesn't fit exactly into one of these very constrained problems that a paper's been written about. That's why you're using one of these random-based optimizers. But yeah, there's a lot of tuning involved. And so I just want to make a note about tuning, which is that it's hard. You don't really know that much about your fitness landscape So it's hard to know a priori what is a good cooling schedule or what's a good mutation rate. So a reasonable way to handle this is to do a grid search. You just have a few different things you want to try out for each parameter that you're tuning, and then you try each combination of those. So this is kind of unfortunate. This is actually like one of the more difficult parts of these algorithms because the structure of the algorithms themselves is fairly simple. So that's just kind of how it is. So finally, evolutionary algorithms was in the title, so now I'm going to talk about that. What I'm talking about right now is basically a genetic algorithm, but the structure is generally the same across different evolutionary algorithms. So what makes evolutionary algorithms different from these other strategies is that you have a population of solutions. So you're probably keeping these in some kind of list. So here's your population. Each of these squares represents a solution. And let's say that the optimum is like a warm color. So we're trying to select warmer colored solutions. So first, there's a selection step. So you go from this population and you want to choose an individual to be a parent. So the basic flow of this algorithm is you're going to replace this population with a population of children, which are closely related to the parent population, and you're just going to evolve the whole population through time, kind of following this biological idea of evolution, of like slow, gradual change of a population through time. So what does the selection look like? A really good selection algorithm is tournament selection. And this is really simple. Basically, you just choose some number of candidates. I personally recommend 2, and the best of those candidates becomes a parent. So just to give you a sense of what the inputs look like, the fits is a list of fitnesses that are associated with like a list of solutions, say. And here I'm setting the tournament size to be 2. So that's just the number of candidates in the tournament. And basically, I'm going to sample from all of the different, from all those different fitnesses, and those are my competitors. Then I'm going to get their fitnesses, and whichever one has the maximum, so I'm treating this as a maximization problem, is the winner, and I return that index. And so then I'm going to take that parent solution, and I'm going to mutate it or recombine it to create a child. And so you can see it's going to be fairly similar to the parent, but you can see it has a slightly different fitness because we've changed it a little bit. So mutation I've already talked about. Recombination is a little bit more complicated. The idea is that you take multiple parents and you take aspects of each of those solutions. So you might take whatever the first parent has, like the first 3 items, and then the second 3 items from the next parent. And then the third step is repopulation. So you repeat these first 2 steps once for every individual in the population until you've completely replaced the parent population, and that's 1 step. So you can see if this was the parent population before, maybe in the next generation it looks a little bit more homogeneous because the better solutions have been chosen more times, and so they are the parents for more of the child solution in the next step. And then over time, the population as a whole is going to start off exploring different areas in the fitness landscape, and over time it's going to converge to the most promising areas and exploit those areas. So there are some major advantages to this. First off, you're unlikely to get stuck in a single local optimum because you're automatically exploring a lot of areas at once. I also think this connection to biology is just really cool and kind of appealing. But there are some disadvantages too. So it can be easy to lose variation quickly if your selection is too strong. There's also more tuning involved. So you have to choose a selection function, you have to choose a mutation function, a recombination function, you have to choose the selection strength, the population size, the mutation size. And all of these things can have either a very small or very large effect on the quality of your final output. And it's hard to know in advance what's going to have a large effect. Although I found a lot of times, like how you're mutating has a really huge effect on the quality of the solution. So this is probably something to spend a little bit more time tuning. So you can also see this algorithm is going to be a lot slower than a hill climber, right? You have to maintain an entire population, and you have to calculate the fitnesses a lot. You have this whole process for selection, and then you have to mutate, you have to keep track of a lot. It's also more memory hungry because you're maintaining all these solutions in memory. And so if each solution takes up a lot of space and you have a large population size, this can slow things down more, it can create its own problems. But overall, these have the potential to be really powerful and to explore a lot more than the algorithms that have only a single solution at once. So just to kind of summarize all of these algorithms, the hill climber is really fast, but it gets stuck easily. The simulated annealing is also pretty fast, and it can explore better. And evolutionary algorithms are generally slow and memory hungry, but potentially really powerful. I also want to give honorable mention to an algorithm I didn't really have time to talk about in detail, which is metropolis-coupled Markov chain Monte Carlo, or MC cubed. And if you're familiar with Markov chain Monte Carlo, you can use it for calculating posteriors, but you can also use it as an optimization algorithm. It's basically simulated annealing with a constant temperature. So in MC cubed, you're running several parallel searches at different constant temperatures. So you have some chains running at very hot temperatures and some at cold temperatures. And then every so often, you give them the chance to swap around. So if the chain running at a hotter temperature finds something promising, then you cool it off and let it exploit that region more. So this is really cool, and it often works really well. But there are some complications with implementing it. So this is my general overview to these different kinds of algorithms. So if this is something that you're interested in, there are a lot of papers and books on optimization. I don't know of a single resource that has all of this information because it's actually coming from a lot of different fields. A lot of these were developed sort of independently of each other, and you have to kind of hunt around to find them all. But for discrete problems, the term you probably want to look up is combinatorial optimization. So there are other evolutionary algorithms that I didn't get a chance to mention, but that are really cool. Differential evolution, evolutionary strategies, which is similar to genetic algorithms, but for floating point values and continuous values instead of discrete ones. Genetic programming, which lets you evolve functions. And ALPS, or age-layered population structure, which is another complication you can add onto these population-based methods. So I also wanted to talk a little bit, so the examples I gave were kind of goofy toy examples, but right now I'm working on my PhD and I wouldn't have much of a dissertation without these algorithms. They're really useful for a lot of problems. They're really useful for hard problems where you don't really know where to start in solving them. And so I've used them to try to generate stable food webs. My background's in ecology. And I've also used them to try to identify similar groups of species, so parasites or top predators, in an ecological system. And I'm currently interning at Civis, and I'm using them there as well for ad spending. So, like I said, I have a GitHub repository that has worked Python examples for hill climber, simulated annealing, MC cubed, and genetic algorithms for the traveling salesman problem. And so this is the link for that. And then you can also look at my blog, and my first post was actually about this. This started as a workshop that I've turned into a talk since. So there's a little bit more detail in that post. And that, I'll take your questions. Yep. Oh, so the question was, do these solutions lend themselves to a training test data split? I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. It might kind of depend on the problem. I would think probably not in a lot of cases. If you're doing something like genetic programming where what you're evolving is actually a function, then it might make sense to train that and then test it. But a lot of times you're just taking a specific data set and trying to find the best solution for that data set. So it doesn't necessarily translate to a training set, test set kind of approach. Yeah. Right, so the question was, what is the basic workflow for this? Do you start writing a hill climber, or do you just skip that? Is it not worth it? That's a really good question. I actually usually start writing a hill climber because the code structure is the simplest. A lot of times I'll prototype these in Python, and then if I need to run it for longer, I'll actually write it in like C or some compiled language. Although depending on the size of your problem, you can get by in Python. So a lot of times I'll start with a hill climber, and then all of the other algorithms are very similar in structure. So from there, you can just sort of roll up a simulated annealing, the MC cubed, and genetic algorithm. A lot of times I write like at least 3 of those and just try different combinations of parameters and see where I get the best results. Yep. So the question was if my implementation of these algorithms differ from other implementations in any meaningful way. I guess I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Like my implementation can vary a little bit based on the data structure that I'm working with to try to like get the most efficiency for that data structure. I mean, the mutation function that I showed and like the initialization function, those were like a little simplistic. I might think a little bit more about my specific problem and say like for the knapsack problem, I was initializing it just like with 50%, like on average, you're going to get 50% ones and 50% zeros. I might change that a little bit to make sure I was starting with a valid solution that fit in my constraint. So there are things like that. But in terms of the basic structure, that's pretty much how it works. Yep. So the question was, is there an open source library for this, or is the problem space different enough that you usually write your own? So I usually end up writing my own. Part of that's because a lot of times I end up using C in the end, so I'll use Python to figure out how I want to handle the data structures. There is a PyMC3 library, but I haven't really looked into it. But in terms of lines of code, these are like pretty fast to roll up, and if you have the structure of one, you can easily like port it to another case. So I don't really know of any open source libraries for these, but it isn't really a huge burden in terms of writing the code. Yeah. Mm. Right. So the question is, how do I choose a mutation function? So it varies by problem, but basically you want to make sure that it's small enough that you're still retaining a lot of the basic characteristics of the parent solution, but you want it to sometimes improve and sometimes like not be as good as the parent, right? So I probably wouldn't choose flipping a bit for the knapsack problem, because once you kind of run into your constraint of the maximum weight, anytime you try to add something to the knapsack, you're not going to have a valid knapsack anymore. So you probably want to like make a bigger change than that so that you can move around a little bit more and not get stuck in like small valleys. So it's mostly trying to tune the size, but something I would recommend is like try a few of them. Like think of what are a few different approaches that might be the right size, or like try tuning the size of the mutation and see how that affects it. Any other questions? Yep. So the question is how do you know how long to run the MC cubed algorithm? So for all of these, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll make a convergence plot. So you can just like keep a history and just like print out to file every, say, like 100 or 1,000 steps, like the current best solution and what the quality of that solution is. And generally you'll see kind of like a decay that, like it'll be sort of a decaying function where you get a huge benefit at first, and then over time you'll get like less and less benefit, and then you've probably gotten the best solution you're going to find. And so if you can run it a few times and get like confidence intervals or like standard errors for that, that'll give you a good sense of how long you need to run it. And that's also really helpful for pitting these different algorithms against each other, right? You can like write one of these for each of your algorithms and then see how those convergence plots differ. But MC cubed has a lot of continuing variation in it. It has like this constant source of variation from the hotter chains. So that one is likely to have a pretty slow convergence, whereas a hill climber is going to have really fast convergence. Anything else? Great, thank you.